What kind of man finds friendship not among men, but in the quiet understanding of creatures who never spoke a word? Welcome, dear friend, wherever you are listening tonight. Perhaps in your home, beside a lamp, or on a quiet walk. Subscribe and let us journey together. This is the story of Saint Martin de Porres, a humble servant of God, born into rejection and obscurity, who transformed suffering into sanctity and silence into miracles, revealing a divine love that even the smallest creature could understand. So begins the life of a child marked by contradiction, loved by God, but rejected by men. In the year 1579, in the vibrant but divided city of Lima, Peru, a boy was born to a Spanish nobleman and a freed black woman from Panama. His name was Martin, though in those first tender years it carried no weight of nobility or inheritance. His father, Don Juan de Porres, would not claim him as a son. His mother, Ana Velázquez, would cradle him with both pride and sorrow, whispering prayers that the world would see what she saw, a child of beauty and grace. Lima was a city of noise and ambition then, filled with merchants, priests, slaves, and nobles, all crossing paths but rarely hearts. The Spanish colonists saw their world as carefully ordered, with lines drawn between races and ranks, each human soul placed in a hierarchy of color. And so Martin, with his skin the color of warm earth and eyes that glowed with quiet intelligence, was not seen as a child of promise, but as a symbol of shame. In those first years, poverty was his inheritance. His mother worked tirelessly to clothe and feed him, sewing garments and cleaning homes for the wealthy who would not look her in the eye. Yet in that small home, where there was little food and less comfort, love lingered. Ana taught her son to kneel before a small wooden crucifix each night, whispering that God never forgot those the world rejected. When Martin looked at the figure of Christ, brown wood upon rough nails, he understood something even as a child, that holiness wasn't found in admiration, but in endurance. The streets of Lima became his first classroom. He watched the procession of people, friars in their white robes, traders with their coins, beggars who reached out hands trembling with hunger. Martin would follow the beggars, not to mock them, but to offer a crust of bread or a kind word. The poor seemed to recognize him even then. They saw in his eyes a gentleness that belonged not to pity, but to shared pain. Among animals, too, Martin found a strange friendship. Stray dogs followed him home, birds perched near his window, and even the timid cats came to rest at his feet. To others, this was nothing. To him, it was a mystery. He did not speak to them, but he felt understood. Perhaps they sensed that this boy's heart, still soft from sorrow, could not bear cruelty. Perhaps they saw in him what humans refused to see. When he was 8 years old, his father returned for a brief visit, drawn perhaps by a flicker of guilt or pride. Seeing Martin's intelligence and calm demeanor, he arranged for the boy to receive some education, a rare mercy. For a few years, Martin studied reading, writing, and the healing arts, showing a natural grace with herbs and simple remedies. But even this small hope would not last. When his father left again, the fragile bridge between them collapsed. Martin and his mother were left behind once more, with only faith and labor to sustain them. In those years, Lima was a city of contradictions, gold and gospel, poverty and pageantry. The cathedrals gleamed with marble, but the poor died in the shadows of their walls. Young Martin grew into this tension, learning the language of both humility and endurance. He watched how the friars spoke of heaven, while the hungry searched for bread. Yet he did not grow bitter. Instead, he grew silent, a silence that was not weakness but contemplation. Often he would retreat to quiet places, kneeling by the dusty roadside or sitting by the riverbank, gazing at the sky until the noise of the city faded. He spoke little of his dreams, but in his heart there was a whisper, a call not from men, but from God. At night, when the streets grew still and his mother slept, Martin would rise and light a small candle before the crucifix. There, in the golden flicker of light, he prayed in words too simple to be written down. "Lord," he might have said, "teach me to serve." He had no ambition of greatness, no thought of sainthood, only the desire to love purely. And perhaps this was the seed of his future holiness, not a desire to be seen, but to disappear into love itself. As he grew older, the burden of his difference deepened. The world around him whispered names that stung like whips: mulatto, half-breed, illegitimate. He never answered. He only bowed his head, not in shame, but in patience. His mother wept for him, but Martin comforted her with a smile that seemed too serene for his years. "God knows," he once told her softly. And indeed, he lived as if that truth were enough. Sometimes he would visit the marketplace, carrying herbs to sell or remedies to trade. There he watched people from every class mingle, yet he noticed how each group built invisible walls around themselves. Even as a boy, Martin longed for a world without those walls, where dignity did not depend on color or birth. It was a dream too vast for his time, yet one he would live into being through compassion alone. In the evenings, when twilight dimmed the city and the first lamps were lit, Martin would sit quietly with his mother and say little. The air of Lima was filled with dust and music, and the scent of burning oil drifted through narrow streets. In such stillness, the boy's thoughts would turn to the saints, those mysterious figures of old whose stories his mother told. He loved most those who had suffered, who were forgotten, who had nothing but faith. He wondered if one could live like that, unseen, unloved, and yet radiant with peace. And so his childhood passed, poor, quiet, and unnoticed by the world. Yet within that obscurity, something luminous began to grow. The grace that hides in suffering, the strength that hides in meekness, the joy that hides in service, all these were being woven silently into the fabric of his soul. He did not yet know the roads he would walk, or the miracles that would follow him. But heaven was already watching the child, who would one day command the language of angels and animals alike. Yet within that small, quiet child was a listening heart. As the years carried him beyond the boundaries of childhood, Martin's world expanded not into comfort, but into duty. By the time he reached his early teens, his hands had already learned the shape of work. Poverty was not a visitor in his home. It was a resident, a silent companion that shaped every choice, every prayer, every dream. His mother, Anna, aged beyond her years, saw in her son a gentleness she did not understand, a stillness that seemed to come from another world. And yet she feared for him, for she knew how cruelly the world judged a man with skin like his. When neighbors mocked or avoided him, Martin would lower his gaze and smile. "They do not know me," he would say softly. "But God does." It was not pride that spoke in him, but peace, a peace that seemed to defy the harshness of life. At 12, he was apprenticed to a barber surgeon, a trade that would change his destiny. In those days, barbers did far more than cut hair. They drew blood, lanced wounds, prepared medicines, and treated the sick when no doctor would. The barber's shop was a place of both healing and humiliation, a space where nobles came to be trimmed and peasants came to be cured. To Martin, it was a school of the body and the soul. He learned quickly, not only with his hands, but with his heart. His master, a stern and practical man, soon noticed that the boy's touch calmed even the most restless patient. Cuts healed faster when Martin dressed them. The smell of herbs seemed sweeter in his presence. It was as though nature itself trusted him. Each morning before the sun rose, Martin would pray in silence. He rose quietly, so as not to disturb his mother, and knelt before the small wooden crucifix. His prayers were not filled with lofty words. They were simple sighs of love. "Teach me to heal as you healed," he would murmur, "to see the suffering as you see them." Then, when daylight came, he would walk through Lima's cobbled streets to the shop. The city was already alive, merchants shouting, carts rumbling, children running barefoot through the dust. But Martin walked as if in another rhythm, his steps steady, his eyes calm. Inside the barber's shop, he worked without complaint. He swept the floors, mixed herbs, cleaned instruments, and attended to the sick. Many clients, seeing his dark complexion, treated him as a servant rather than a healer. Some would not even meet his gaze. He endured it all with quiet dignity. One afternoon, while assisting a nobleman, the man spat cruel words at him, calling him a creature unworthy of human care. Martin did not answer. Instead, he continued his task, binding the man's arm where a small cut bled. When he finished, he bowed and said only, "May God heal more than your wound." The nobleman was silent. Days later he returned, humbled, apologetic, changed. Perhaps it was shame. Perhaps it was grace. In time, Martin's skill became known beyond his master's door. The poor began to seek him out. They came limping, coughing, trembling, some without coin, some without hope. He never turned them away. "What you cannot pay, offer to God," he would say. With herbs he gathered himself, and remedies mixed by hand. He cured fevers, soothed wounds, and comforted the dying. He would often kneel beside the sick, whispering prayers while placing a hand upon their brow. Some claimed to feel warmth spread through their bodies, a peace that lingered long after he left. But Martin made no claim of miracle. "It is God," he said simply. "I am only His instrument." Still, his heart yearned for more than trade. The barber's chair, the scent of oil and soap, the clatter of metal. These were not the sounds his soul desired. He longed for the stillness of prayer, the rhythm of monastic life, the nearness of the Eucharist. Yet he knew that for one like him, a mixed-race son of no title, the door to the religious orders was all but closed. The laws of Lima forbade men of his heritage from taking vows. The color of his skin was considered a mark of shame, not a badge of sanctity. But Martin, who had learned to live by faith and not by fairness, did not despair. He said nothing of his dream to his mother, fearing to burden her heart. Instead, he began to visit the Dominican friary of Our Lady of the Rosary, a great white building that loomed over the city like a promise he dared not claim. There, he would offer to sweep the floors, polish the brass, tend the gardens, anything to serve. The friars, seeing his diligence, allowed him to help. He became a familiar figure, moving quietly through the corridors with a broom or a bucket, his eyes lowered but his spirit lifted. In those humble tasks, he found what his heart had always sought: peace. Often, when no one was watching, he would kneel before the statue of the Virgin Mary and whisper his longing. "Mother," he prayed, "let me belong to your Son." The friars soon noticed that strange things happened when Martin was near. The sick recovered. Quarreling brothers reconciled. Animals that had wandered into the courtyard seemed to linger by his side, tame and still. The prior, curious, once observed him as he worked. He saw the young man pause in the garden, take a wounded bird gently into his hands, and breathe upon it. The bird fluttered, then flew away, whole. Martin only smiled, unaware he was being watched. The prior said nothing then, but he remembered. After 3 years of service, Martin asked to remain in the convent as a lay helper. It was all he dared request, for full membership was forbidden to one of his race. The prior agreed, moved by his humility. Thus Martin entered the Dominican house, not as a friar, not as a brother, but as a servant. Yet, as time would show, heaven measures souls differently from men. At first, he was assigned the lowest tasks. He swept corridors, emptied chamber pots, mended torn habits, and cared for the sick in the infirmary. No task was beneath him. No insult broke him. Some friars mocked him, calling him the mulatto of the broom. Martin only bowed his head and continued to sweep. The rhythm of the broom became his prayer, the dust his offering. In the stillness of his labor, he found communion with Christ, who had knelt to wash the feet of his disciples. And so, in that quiet servitude, a new chapter began. The boy who once healed the poor of Lima now served the house of God itself. The city outside still hummed with pride and prejudice, but within those cloistered walls, a miracle was beginning to unfold. Not of sudden vision or sound, but of patient love lived in silence. In the sharp scent of herbs and the hum of scissors, Martin's vocation began to whisper. The rhythm of the barber's shop had trained his hands to heal, but the quiet rhythm of monastic life began to train his heart to love without measure. Each morning, before the first bell rang through the convent halls, Martin was already awake. He would kneel on the cold stone floor of his small cell and whisper prayers into the stillness, thanking God for another day to serve. He did not ask for recognition, nor comfort, nor reward. He only asked that his work, no matter how small, might reflect divine mercy. To him, sweeping floors and tending wounds were not separate things. Both were forms of healing. Both were ways to love. Within the Dominican convent of Our Lady of the Rosary, the days unfolded like a chant, predictable, ordered, and serene. But beneath that quiet rhythm, Martin's soul deepened in hidden ways. His fellow friars, though some remained skeptical of him, began to notice the peace that seemed to surround him. Even when he was silent, the air around him carried a certain warmth. He spoke little, smiled easily, and moved with the careful gentleness of one who saw the world not as something to be conquered, but to be tended. When the sick came to the convent seeking help, it was often Martin who met them first. He would guide them to the infirmary, clean their wounds, offer broth, and whisper a short prayer before leaving them to rest. In those early years, Martin continued his work as a barber within the convent. His small workshop became a place of quiet charity. Nobles and commoners alike came for his service, and many left with more than a trimmed beard. They left with hearts strangely lightened. It was said that when Martin touched a man's head or face, the bitterness in that man's soul seemed to soften. Some called it imagination. Others, perhaps more honest, began to call it grace. But Martin never spoke of it. He believed that whatever goodness came through him came only from God. He was, as he would later tell a novice, a broom in the hands of the Lord. He may sweep where he wills. His humility did not shield him from cruelty. Some brothers still found reasons to mock him, irritated by the ease with which he forgave. They whispered about his parentage, about the color of his skin, about his strange quietness. Once, a brother threw open the door to Martin's cell and found him praying with his arms outstretched in the shape of a cross. "Are you trying to be a saint?" the man sneered. Martin only lowered his arms and smiled gently. "No," he said softly. "I am only trying to love him." The brother left, unsettled. For in Martin's humility there was a strength that could not be mocked away. In time, the prior came to trust him deeply. When a problem arose among the friars, a dispute, a sickness, a shortage, it was often Martin who found the quiet solution. He did not impose, he simply appeared where help was needed. If the infirmary lacked medicine, he went into the city to beg for herbs or supplies. If the kitchen ran out of food, he found a way to feed the hungry with what little there was. "Brother Martin," the prior would say, "how did you manage this?" And Martin would reply, "I asked God, and he provided." It was not boasting. It was simple truth. He also continued to care for the poor outside the convent walls. Each evening, after his work was done, he would slip through the gate into the dark streets of Lima. There he carried small packets of food, remedies, and clean cloths. He visited those who lived in hovels, the abandoned and the forgotten. Many knew his face, though few knew his name. They called him the Brown Angel, for he came silently and left without taking credit. Once, during a fever outbreak, he tended to dozens of the sick, washing their sores with his bare hands. When warned that he might catch the disease, he answered, "I will not die before God wills it, and until then, I am safe in his work." None who served with him ever saw fear in his eyes. It was around this time that the first stories of Martin's strange gift began to spread. A novice who had fallen gravely ill claimed that Martin entered his room one night and laid a cool hand upon his forehead. By morning, the fever had broken. The boy swore he had seen a soft light surrounding Martin as he prayed. When others asked Martin if it was true, he only shook his head and said, "God is merciful. Nothing more." Another friar, who had lost his temper and struck Martin in a fit of anger, later confessed that his own hand became swollen and painful for days afterward. He sought Martin's forgiveness, which was freely given, and as soon as Martin blessed the hand, the pain vanished. These stories were whispered, never written, but they traveled through the convent like the scent of incense. In his work as barber and healer, Martin's compassion was boundless. He once treated a wounded dog that had been beaten nearly to death. He cleaned the creature's wounds and nursed it until it could walk again. The dog followed him faithfully thereafter, sleeping outside his door at night. Another time, he rescued a starved mule from the market and led it to the convent garden, feeding it from his own plate. To the brothers who mocked his affection for animals, he said, "The beasts are God's creatures too. We are bound to them by love, for the same hands made us all." His words, simple as they were, struck deeper than any sermon. Yet even amid the gentle routine of his days, Martin's humility was tested. One evening, a visiting priest discovered that Martin was still listed as a servant rather than a lay brother, a position that denied him full standing in the order. The priest protested to the prior, saying that it was unjust, but Martin begged him not to intervene. "Do not speak for me, Father," he said quietly. "I am where I belong. If the Lord wanted me higher, he would lift me." His humility disarmed even those who sought to defend him. And so, life went on in quiet sanctity. The city outside pulsed with wealth and conflict, but within the white walls of the convent, Martin continued his hidden labor. The broom was his companion, the sick his family, the poor his parish. He seemed to live already halfway between earth and heaven, his body among men, his heart with God. When asked once why he worked so tirelessly, he smiled and replied, "Because the Lord never stops working." He did not yet know the wonders that would come, the miraculous healings, the creatures who would answer his voice, the strange power that would lift him beyond the laws of the world. For now, he was only the humble barber, the servant of the servants of God. But heaven, patient as always, was preparing to reveal through him what love looks like when it takes the shape of perfect humility. The world would not call him brother, yet heaven had already claimed him as one. As Martin's reputation grew quietly within the Dominican community, his life began to move deeper into the heart of service. The Friary of Our Lady of the Rosary in Lima was no grand palace, though its whitewashed walls and echoing corridors seemed to hold the size of centuries of prayer. The daily rhythm of bells and chanting filled its courtyards with an air of ordered devotion. Yet behind those serene sounds was a world still shaped by hierarchy, where birth and color often mattered more than virtue. Martin knew this well, but he never let it take root as bitterness. If others saw him as lesser, he accepted it as an invitation to become smaller still, until nothing remained but the love of Christ working through him. He rose before dawn each morning, long before the others stirred. In the dim light of his small cell, he would kneel before a simple crucifix, a wooden figure carved with rough hands, its face worn smooth by the touch of devotion. There he would pray, not for favor or relief, but for the grace to be faithful in the smallest things. "Let me be forgotten, Lord," he would whisper, "if only you are remembered." Then he would begin his daily tasks, sweeping the chapel floors, polishing brass candlesticks, cleaning the infirmary, tending to the gardens that bloomed quietly behind the convent walls. He worked with a rhythm that seemed almost musical, a steady offering of motion and silence. The friars grew used to his presence, though few understood him. To some, he was merely the quiet mulatto servant who could fix anything, who seemed never to sleep, and who smiled no matter the burden. To others, he was a mystery, a man whose eyes held both gentleness and a kind of sorrow. There was no ambition in him, no trace of resentment, only an abiding peace that disarmed even the proud. Once, a young novice, weary of the constant chores assigned to him, complained bitterly. Martin listened quietly, and then took up the broom from the boy's hands. "Let me do this for you," he said. The novice, shamed by the sight, protested, but Martin only smiled. "It is no trouble. The angels sweep the heavens. I may sweep this floor." From that day on, the boy worked with renewed patience. The convent infirmary became Martin's second home. It was there that his compassion found its fullest expression. The sick and dying were brought there daily. Friars suffering from fevers, townspeople who had no other refuge, slaves beaten and left to rot by their masters. Martin treated them all the same. He washed their wounds, whispered prayers, and offered comfort. His remedies, made from herbs and oils he prepared himself, were simple but effective. Many who were near death recovered, and even those who did not survive died in peace, their last sight the calm face of the humble lay brother. He had a gift for easing pain, not only of the body, but of the soul. In one story, a friar who had contracted a contagious disease was isolated in a locked room to prevent the spread of infection. The others were too afraid to enter, and so he was left alone, weak and despairing. But one night, when the door was found still barred, Martin was seen kneeling at his bedside. "Brother Martin," the prior scolded later, "how did you get inside?" Martin lowered his eyes. "Forgive me, Father," he said softly. "The poor man needed me. I did not think the rules of the convent should stand above the law of charity." It was said afterward that the friar recovered, and the prior, moved by both the miracle and the humility, no longer rebuked him for following mercy rather than fear. Martin's small acts of care spread beyond the convent. The poor of Lima began to know his name, and many came to the gates seeking his help. He would meet them quietly, often slipping food from the convent kitchen or offering medicine he had made himself. He cared for children abandoned in the streets, for old men forgotten by their families, and for the slaves who had fled cruelty only to find hunger waiting for them. God has left me with 2 hands, he would say. It would be a sin not to use them for love. His charity had no boundary, his tenderness no preference. Not all the friars approved. Some murmured that Martin gave too freely, that he risked bringing disease or ruin upon the house. Others resented that he, a servant by status, had gained the trust of the prior and the affection of the townspeople. But Martin never defended himself. When rebuked, he bowed his head and said, "You are right, brother. I will be more careful." Then he went on doing good in secret. It was as though his soul had learned a language beyond argument, the quiet dialect of mercy. Despite his humility, Martin's presence carried a strange authority. Even the wild animals that roamed the city seemed to sense it. Birds perched on his shoulder as he worked. Cats and dogs followed him through the convent courtyard. The brothers would sometimes find him feeding a group of mice with crumbs from his pocket, speaking to them as though they were his companions. "They eat only what they need," he would say gently. "Perhaps they are wiser than we are." His love for creatures was not sentimentality, but reverence, the same reverence he held for all living things made by God. One afternoon, a brother found him in the garden, tending to a small plant that had withered. "Why waste your time on that dying thing?" the brother asked. Martin smiled. "Because it has life," he said, watering the fragile leaves. "And life, however small, deserves care." That moment captured something of his essence, his faith in the sacredness of the ordinary. He saw in every living being a reflection of the Creator, and in every act of care a form of prayer. As the years passed, Martin's reputation as a healer and helper spread throughout Lima. The rich came secretly to seek his counsel. The poor came openly for his comfort. Yet he remained the same, barefoot, calm, and hidden. The prior once offered to have his status elevated, to make him an official member of the order despite his birth. Martin refused. "No, Father," he said quietly. "I was born to be poor. Let me serve in my own way." Such humility baffled even the most devout. But Martin understood something they did not, that holiness grows best in the soil of humility, watered by obedience and hidden from praise. At night, when the convent was silent and the city beyond lay sleeping, Martin would walk through the cloisters, stopping before the chapel door. He would kneel and whisper, "Lord, keep me small. Let me be nothing so that you may be everything." In those quiet vigils, it was said, strange lights sometimes shone beneath the door, and the scent of flowers filled the air, though none were near. The friars spoke of it in hushed voices, uncertain whether to call it miracle or mystery. Martin himself never spoke of such things. And so the years unfolded, one humble act at a time, weaving a tapestry of grace that few would recognize until long after his death. The world outside the convent was changing, wars, wealth, and new empires rising and falling. But within those simple white walls, a man of no rank was building a kingdom of love invisible to human eyes. He did not preach, he did not write, he did not seek fame. He simply lived the gospel with his hands. Day after day, he swept the same corridors, each motion a quiet offering. Though others might have seen monotony in his labor, for Martin it was a liturgy of the body. Each step, each movement of the broom, was a rhythm of prayer, a silent conversation between the soul and its Creator. The convent floor gleamed because of his devotion, not his diligence. It was not cleanliness he sought, but purity of heart, a mirror for divine love. He learned to find joy in invisibility, to rejoice in the unnoticed, to labor without reward. His smile, gentle and constant, became a kind of sacrament to those who crossed his path. In that time, the convent's infirmary was often full. Lima was plagued by poverty and disease, and the Dominican friars, though devout, were unprepared for the endless stream of suffering. Martin stepped into that need without hesitation. He tended to wounds others refused to touch, lifted bodies others feared to approach. He did not flinch at the smell of decay, nor recoil at the sores of leprosy. He saw Christ in every broken face, in every fevered whisper. When a dying man once begged him for water, Martin knelt beside him, held his head, and murmured, "Here, brother, drink what God has given." The man's trembling ceased, and peace returned to his eyes. He died moments later with a faint smile. The friars who witnessed it whispered that something sacred had passed between them, something wordless and divine. But the work was not easy. Many nights Martin would retreat to his cell long after the others had slept. His body ached, his hands were raw, and yet he would kneel, arms extended in the shape of a cross, his face pressed to the floor. Sometimes he remained that way for hours, lost in silent prayer. The brothers who passed by in the early hours would sometimes hear him weeping softly, or singing psalms in a voice that trembled with exhaustion and love. When they asked why he did not rest, he would smile and say, "How can I sleep while others suffer? My body will sleep one day. My soul must stay awake." Despite his humility, small miracles began to mark his path. Once, a friar sliced his hand deeply while working in the kitchen. The wound bled heavily, and panic spread among the novices. Martin came, wrapped the injured hand gently in a piece of linen, and whispered a prayer. Within moments, the bleeding stopped, and the pain disappeared. The friar stared in disbelief as the skin closed without a scar. "It is not I," Martin said quietly, "but he who lives in me." From that day forward, the brothers looked upon him with new reverence, though he continued to insist that he was nothing more than God's servant. His compassion extended beyond men to every creature that drew breath. The story is told that the friary was once overrun by mice, which gnawed through the stores and pantries. The brothers, angry and weary, set traps to kill them. Martin, upon seeing the dead and dying animals, felt sorrow pierce his heart. "Poor little ones," he said. "They are hungry too." That night he gathered the remaining mice and spoke to them gently. "Go now," he said, "to the garden behind the walls, where I will bring you food. There you may live without harm, and we will have peace." The next morning, not a single mouse was found within the convent. True to his word, Martin brought them crumbs each evening, and they came when he called. The brothers laughed at first, then marveled. From that day on, the creatures seemed to obey him. Dogs, cats, birds, even the smallest insects, seemed drawn to his voice, which carried the calmness of one at peace with creation. But not all his trials were gentle. Prejudice lingered even within the walls of holiness. There were those who resented his growing renown, who whispered that his miracles were tricks or delusions. One brother, jealous of his virtue, accused him of pride, saying, "He pretends humility, but he seeks admiration." Martin bowed his head and replied, "If I am proud, pray for me, brother, that God will make me small again." His words silenced the accuser, who later came to him in confession, moved by the very meekness he had mocked. The prior, Fray Juan de Lorenzana, began to see in Martin not a servant, but a soul touched by heaven. One day, when the convent faced severe poverty, with debts piling and food scarce, Martin approached him quietly. "Father," he said, "may I give away some of what we have to those who are hungrier than we?" The prior frowned. "We have almost nothing," he replied. "If we give, we may starve." Martin smiled faintly. "If we give, Father, God will provide." Against his better judgment, the prior consented. That night, Martin distributed much of the convent's remaining food among the poor. The next morning, the stores were full again. No one could explain how. The prior, shaken, sought Martin out. "What have you done?" he asked. Martin bowed. "Only what love required." His life moved in such small, radiant acts, unnoticed by most but woven into eternity. When he walked through Lima, even the air seemed gentler around him. He greeted everyone, rich or poor, with the same kindness. He once knelt before a beggar whose sores oozed with infection and kissed his wounds. A merchant passing by recoiled in horror. "You will catch his disease," he cried. Martin looked up, his eyes calm. "Better to catch his pain than to leave him alone in it," he answered. The merchant, years later, would tell that story to his own children, saying he had met a living saint. Within the convent, Martin's presence became a quiet force of unity. When quarrels broke out among the brothers, he would enter the room without a word, and the anger would melt. He never scolded or corrected. His silence itself was like a prayer, drawing the hearts of men back to gentleness. Some said that when he prayed in the chapel, they saw his body lifted from the ground, suspended in stillness. Others claimed that light surrounded him, soft and golden. He dismissed all such tales. "If I rise," he once said, "it is only because love is lighter than air." Years of labor wore his body thin, but his spirit only grew stronger. Those who knew him in these years said his eyes seemed to look beyond the world, as though he already saw what others only hoped for. When a wealthy benefactor offered to pay for his elevation to a full brotherhood within the order, Martin refused. "My place is here," he said simply. "If heaven is as merciful as I believe, even a servant will have a home there." His words carried neither resentment nor irony, only peace. As Lima grew and changed, as empires rose and decayed, the quiet friar remained the same, sweeping floors, healing the sick, feeding the poor. The people outside the convent began to call him the Saint of the Broom. He never heard the title, nor would he have accepted it. But those who encountered him carried the mark of his kindness long after. To them, his silence spoke more than sermons. His humility preached louder than words. And still, he prayed each night in his little cell, whispering, "Lord, let me love without measure, serve without rest, and die without regret." Then one day, the fragrance of mystery began to follow him. It happened so quietly, almost imperceptibly, that few at first understood what they were witnessing. Martin had long been a servant of service, the man who swept, who healed, who prayed. But now something beyond duty began to unfold. His presence seemed to alter the very air around him, as if peace itself moved when he did. The sick who came to him left restored, the sorrowful left with new hope, and those who despised him found their bitterness strangely softened. Word began to spread through Lima, not of the humble lay brother who worked in the Dominican convent, but of the man who could cure what no doctor could name. It began with small signs. A child brought to the convent, burning with fever, was placed in Martin's arms. He prayed softly over her, his lips barely moving, his hand resting lightly on her forehead. Before dawn, the fever broke, and she opened her eyes. The child's mother fell at his feet, weeping. Martin only smiled and helped her stand. "Thank God," he said simply. "It is his gift." He spoke those words often, and always the same way, not as denial, but as reverence. He believed with the innocence of a child and the faith of a mystic that healing flowed from heaven through love alone. The friars began to notice that he seemed to know things no one had told him. Once, during a time of scarcity, when the infirmary had run out of food for the sick, Martin appeared carrying a basket of bread and fish. When asked where it came from, he replied, "From our provider, who never forgets the poor." Some said they saw the basket refilled even as he gave its contents away. Another time, a brother traveling far from Lima was gravely injured. Martin, who had never left the convent, was seen suddenly kneeling in prayer, his face filled with light. Later that day, the wounded brother returned, saying a man who looked exactly like Martin had appeared to him on the road, bound his wounds, and vanished. The friars began to whisper of bilocation, of Martin being in two places at once. He would only smile when told of these things and reply, "Love travels faster than feet." Not all received these tales with joy. Some within the convent grew uneasy, suspecting deception or superstition. One friar confronted him openly, accusing him of sorcery. "You make fools believe you work wonders," the man said. "Do you think God grants miracles to a servant?" Martin bowed his head. "Brother," he said softly, "if the Lord wills to use a broken vessel, should the vessel boast or resist?" His humility disarmed even the harshest critics. The same friar later fell ill, and it was Martin who nursed him back to life. Outside the convent, the city's poor began to see him as their guardian. He walked among them, barefoot, carrying a pouch of herbs, a rosary, and the peace that clung to his every step. He entered huts where the air was thick with fever and disease. He prayed over the dying, sat beside widows, and cradled infants no one else would touch. Many swore that when he prayed, the smell of lilies filled the room. He healed wounds, yes, but more than that, he healed despair. People began to follow him through the streets, seeking a touch, a word, a blessing. He always spoke the same phrase, "God loves you more than you know." But Martin's gifts went beyond healing. There were times when his compassion seemed to alter nature itself. One evening, a cart filled with firewood overturned in the street, crushing a mule beneath it. The animal screamed in agony, and bystanders began to shout, unable to free it. Martin arrived, laid his hand upon the creature's head, and prayed aloud, "Lord, you care even for these, the least of your servants." The mule fell silent, stood up, and walked away uninjured. The witnesses stood in stunned silence. Martin turned to them and said, "Do you see? Even beasts obey love." He had a way of entering suffering as if it were a sacred space. When plague came to Lima, spreading terror through the city, Martin did not hesitate. While others fled, he went door to door, carrying bread and medicine. He wiped the sores of the infected with his own hands and comforted the dying, whispering prayers of forgiveness. It was said that not once did he fall ill. "Fear," he told the brothers who begged him to stop, "is not for those who trust the mercy of God." He saw in the disease not punishment, but a chance for compassion. "When we touch the sick," he once said, "we touch Christ himself." In the infirmary, miracles became almost ordinary. One man who had lost his sight was led to Martin, who prayed over him and anointed his eyes with oil. "See now what God shows you," he said gently. The man blinked, wept, and saw again. Another, dying from infection, heard Martin praying in the corridor and called out for him. By the time Martin entered, the man's fever had vanished. The prior, who witnessed many such events, could only shake his head in awe. "Brother Martin," he said once, "you ask for nothing, yet God gives you everything." Martin replied, "Because I ask only to love." And yet, amid all this wonder, Martin remained as humble as the day he first swept the convent floors. He refused to be called brother, preferring servant. When gifts were offered in gratitude, he gave them to the poor. When praised, he turned silent. "The glory belongs to God," he would say, and the work to my hands. He fasted often, eating only bread and fruit, spending long nights in prayer. He sought no recognition, no comfort, no power. To him, holiness was not in miracles, but in patience. Still, there were moments when even he marveled at what God allowed. One night, a friar entered the chapel and saw Martin kneeling before the tabernacle. A soft radiance surrounded him, and his body, though motionless, was lifted slightly from the ground. The friar, terrified and trembling, backed away, only to hear Martin's voice whisper, "Do not fear, brother. When love grows light, the body forgets its weight." Later, when the friar spoke of it, Martin asked him gently to keep it secret. "If people knew," he said, "they would look at me instead of him." Despite his humility, the stories could not be contained. Lima began to whisper of the saint who lived among them, though the church had not yet named him so. Rich and poor alike came to the convent gates. Some sought cures, others counsel. A few came merely to see the man whose kindness had become legend, and always he received them with the same calm gentleness, offering not spectacle, but compassion. "Pray," he would say, "and forgive." There were times, too, when the weight of his calling pressed upon him. He once told a confidant, "It is a strange thing, to be so small, and yet to hold so much suffering in one's heart. But if the Lord carried the cross, can I not carry a splinter?" In that quiet admission lay the secret of his sanctity. Not power, not miracle, but love that chose to suffer alongside others. By now, even the prior sought his counsel. When debts troubled the convent, Martin advised charity. When disputes arose, he spoke of peace. His wisdom, born not of study but of prayer, carried an authority that scholars could not rival. Once, when the prior scolded him for giving away too much to the poor, Martin smiled and said, "Father, do not fear to be generous with God's goods. His hand is larger than ours." Days later, unexpected donations arrived at the convent door, more than replacing what had been lost. It seemed as though the Lord himself confirmed every act of faith that flowed from Martin's heart. Yet he never ceased to see himself as the least of all. "If God can use me," he once said, "he can use anyone. It is love that performs miracles, not the man." As the sun set over Lima, casting long shadows across the convent walls, Martin could often be found sitting quietly in the garden, surrounded by animals. A cat nestled beside a dog, a bird perched on his shoulder, and mice scurried harmlessly near his feet. To those who saw him there, he seemed part of another world, a bridge between heaven and earth, between man and creation, between what is wounded and what is whole. Even the smallest creatures began to obey his voice, as though creation itself remembered its maker. It was in these years that the tender mystery of Martin's friendship with animals began to unfold, not as legend or embellishment, but as a living reflection of harmony lost and found. The brothers in the convent soon learned that no being was too humble, no life too small to escape his care. He saw in the stray dog, the wounded bird, and the trembling mouse the same spark of divine love that moved within his own soul. To him, all of creation was one vast hymn of praise, and man, in his pride, had simply forgotten the melody. The tale most often told began with the infestation of mice that had overtaken the convent's storehouse. The brothers had grown frustrated, their food stores dwindling as the creatures chewed through the sacks of grain. One morning, the prior ordered traps to be set and poison laid out. When Martin heard this, he felt an ache of sorrow. "Father," he said gently, "they are only seeking food, as we all do." The prior, weary of the problem, waved him off. "Would you have us starve to feed vermin, Brother Martin?" Martin bowed his head. "No, Father. I would have us trust that God's peace extends even to them." That night, when the corridors were still and the brothers slept, Martin went to the storeroom with a small basket of crumbs. He knelt and whispered into the shadows, his voice soft as a prayer. "Little brothers," he said, "you do harm where you need not. Come with me. I will feed you elsewhere." From the darkness came a rustling, then silence, and then, one by one, the mice emerged, dozens of them, their small eyes glinting in the lamplight. Without fear, they followed him through the corridor and out to the garden beyond the walls. There, he set the basket down. "Here is your table," he said. "Eat and trouble no one." From that night on, not a single mouse entered the convent again. The brothers marveled, some laughing, some crossing themselves, unsure whether to call it miracle or madness. Martin only smiled and said, "Love has many languages, even for the smallest of God's creatures." It was not the only time the natural world responded to him. A dog, half-starved and covered in wounds, once limped to the convent gate. The porter would have driven it away, but Martin stopped him. He lifted the trembling animal into his arms and carried it to his room. There, he washed its sores with cool water, dressed them with herbs, and fed it from his own bowl. When it recovered, it refused to leave, sleeping by his door each night as if to guard him. Soon after, a cat appeared, and then a mouse, timid and frail. To the astonishment of all, Martin placed the three together, dog, cat, and mouse, and set before them one bowl of food. The prior, passing by, stopped at the doorway and stared. The animals ate peacefully, side by side. Martin looked up and said quietly, "See, Father, when there is love, there is no fear." The prior said nothing, only bowed his head, for in that simple act he saw more theology than in all the learned books he had read. Word of such things spread through Lima. Some dismissed them as tales of simple folk, others as holy mysteries. But those who had known Martin, who had watched the gentleness of his hands and the patience of his heart, knew these stories carried truth. He never sought to prove or explain them. When asked how such peace was possible, he said, "Because I speak to them as God speaks to us, without anger." There was no boast, no mystery in his tone. He believed that the language of love was understood by all beings, that cruelty was a wound in the order of creation, and that healing it, even in the smallest creature, was part of restoring the world to grace. Children especially adored him. They would follow him through the streets, tugging at his robe, calling, "Brother Martin, tell us a story." He would smile and tell them not of miracles but of kindness. "If you see a bird fallen from its nest," he would say, "lift it gently. If you find a dog hungry, feed it. These are small things, but heaven is built from small things." In his words, there was no grand doctrine, only the rhythm of mercy. The poor began to tell one another that Martin's compassion extended even to the earth itself, that he blessed seeds before they were planted, and they grew more plentifully, that flowers seemed to turn toward him when he passed. Whether these things were true or legend scarcely mattered. What mattered was the truth his life revealed, that holiness doesn't separate man from creation, but reconciles him with it. Among the friars, Martin's influence deepened. His love for animals, once mocked as childish, began to teach them something of tenderness. Those who had been quick to scorn the lowly learned to speak more kindly, to work with gentler hands. The infirmary, once feared for its stench and suffering, became a place of strange serenity. It was said that even the dying died more peacefully when Martin stood beside them, whispering prayers that seemed to soften the edge of pain. He often spoke to them of Christ's mercy, not as a distant promise, but as a presence already near. "Do not be afraid," he would say. "He is closer than your breath." His connection to nature reflected something deeper, a harmony of soul that mirrored Eden before the fall. He saw in every creature, every flower, every breath of wind, a reflection of divine order. Creation still remembers its maker, he once told a brother, but man forgets. We must learn from the beasts and the birds how to trust again. When storms came, he would pray, and the winds seemed to calm. When drought threatened the gardens, he blessed the soil, and rain fell within the weak. He made no claim to power, for he saw no division between prayer and nature. To him, both were part of the same eternal song. But beneath this serenity lay sorrow, too. Martin knew that the same world he loved so deeply was also cruel, divided by greed and pride. He saw slaves beaten in the streets, children abandoned, animals mistreated, and he wept. "How far we have fallen," he once murmured, "to forget that we are all made from the same dust." Yet even in sorrow, his hope did not waver. "God will make it right," he would say. "If not today, then tomorrow. If not in time, then in eternity." The brothers began to call him Brother Charity. They found that in his presence, anger could not stand. Quarrels ended, despair eased. One novice, troubled by temptation and shame, came to Martin in tears, confessing that he felt unworthy of his vocation. Martin placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "None of us are worthy, brother. That is why God is so merciful." The young man later said it was as if the weight of years had lifted from his heart. To the city, Martin became both legend and comfort. Women brought their children to be blessed, sailors asked his prayers before voyages, merchants sought his counsel in times of fear. Yet he remained as he had always been, the servant with the broom, the healer with gentle eyes, the man who found friends among the forgotten. He continued to care for the animals that gathered at the convent gates, feeding them each morning before tending to the sick. Once, when asked why he wasted food on creatures when so many people were hungry, he answered simply, "Because they too hunger, and God's mercy has no limit." Perhaps it was this limitless mercy that made him seem otherworldly, even as he lived among men. He did not seek to escape the world, but to sanctify it. Every act of kindness, every gentle word, was a bridge between the divine and the human, the visible and the unseen. He lived as though heaven had already begun, and those who knew him could not help but believe it might be so. But holiness does not protect the heart from wounds. The grace that surrounded Martin did not make him immune to the cruelty of men. It only made him love more deeply. The very humility that drew souls toward him also exposed him to contempt. For all his virtues, for all the miracles whispered in the streets of Lima, there were still those, even within the house of God, who looked upon him with disdain. He was still, in their eyes, the illegitimate son of a freed slave, a mulatto whose place was to serve, not to stand beside them in prayer. The old hierarchies of the world had followed them into the convent, invisible but sharp as blades. Martin endured it in silence. When a brother passed him without greeting, he bowed nonetheless. When others mocked the color of his skin, he smiled and returned to his work. "It is no matter," he once said quietly. "Our Lord too was despised." But his heart, though strong, wasn't made of stone. There were nights when he knelt before the crucifix and whispered, "Lord, they see only what I am not. Teach me to see what you see." There was pain in that prayer, but not resentment, only a longing for the world to awaken to love. Once, during a community meal, Martin was asked by a visiting friar to leave the table. "A servant should not dine with brothers," the man said coldly. The room fell silent. The prior hesitated, torn between custom and conscience. Martin rose, bowed low, and left without a word. Later that evening, the prior found him alone in the garden, kneeling in prayer. "Brother Martin," he said softly, "I am ashamed. I should have spoken." Martin shook his head. "Do not be troubled, Father," he replied. "It is better to be humble in the garden than proud at the table." The prior wept, for he saw in that response a holiness deeper than any sermon could teach. Still, the injustice of such prejudice weighed upon the community. Some brothers began to question the laws that barred men of color from full membership in the order. They saw how Martin lived the rule of St. Dominic more purely than any of them, obedient, charitable, and poor in spirit. But Martin himself never asked for change. "Let me be as I am," he said. "If the Lord desires me higher, he will lift me." It was not indifference that made him say it, but trust. He believed that the ladder to heaven began not with rights or titles, but with surrender. Outside the convent, Lima bore the same marks of division. The city glittered with Spanish wealth, great mansions of white stone and golden churches that towered above the crowded alleys of the poor. Slavery was still woven into its fabric. Human lives were bought and sold in its markets as easily as spices or silk. Martin saw it all, not with bitterness, but with sorrow. He walked among slaves and freedmen alike, tending their wounds, comforting their hearts. To each he spoke the same truth. "You are children of God. No chain can take that from you." Many wept at those words, for no one had ever spoken to them so. One day, while walking through the market, Martin came upon a young African slave who had been beaten nearly to death. The boy's master had left him for dead in the dust. Martin knelt beside him, lifted his head gently, and whispered a prayer. He carried him back to the convent in his arms, though the law forbade bringing slaves within holy grounds. When the prior questioned him, Martin said, "Forgive me, Father. I did not know that charity had color." The prior, struck to silence, could not rebuke him. The boy recovered, and for years thereafter served the convent faithfully, not as a slave, but as a brother in spirit. There was another day when a nobleman, proud and refined, came to the convent seeking healing. He had heard of Martin's gifts, but could not hide his disdain. When Martin entered the room, the man turned away. "I did not expect a mulatto," he muttered. Martin said nothing, only placed a cool hand on his brow. The nobleman felt his fever break within moments. Tears filled his eyes, and he whispered, "Forgive me." Martin smiled gently. "There is nothing to forgive. We all see dimly until the light comes." From that day on, the man became one of his most faithful benefactors. Racism did not merely come from strangers. There were times even among the devout when Martin's patience was tested. Some brothers would mock his accent, others his silence. Yet every insult became for him an offering. "Christ was silent before his judges," he would say. "So must I be." But there was one moment when even his patience seemed to reach its limit. A wealthy man, visiting the convent, accused him of stealing a gold coin that had gone missing. Martin fell to his knees before him, begging the man's forgiveness, though he was innocent. Later, the coin was found, dropped beneath the man's own cloak. When the prior apologized, Martin replied, "I am happy to be falsely accused, for it reminds me of him who was accused for us all." His words cut through the shame of those who heard them. The hurt of rejection, however, shaped something profound in him, a love that refused to draw boundaries. He became a bridge between worlds, between Spaniard and slave, rich and poor, master and servant. In his eyes, there were no ranks, no divisions, only souls. The people of Lima began to notice how he treated everyone with the same dignity, from the beggar at the gate to the bishop who visited the convent. "To love one soul more than another," he once said, "is to love less than God loves." Those who heard him knew that he spoke from experience, for his life was the living proof of it. One evening, when a fellow friar spoke bitterly about injustice and the cruelty of men, Martin listened in silence and then said softly, "Hatred is the sickness of the soul. You cannot cure it with anger. Only mercy can heal what pride has broken." He did not mean that injustice should be ignored, only that it must be met with love so radical that it disarms cruelty itself. "If we strike back," he said, "we become what we despise. But if we forgive, we remind the world that heaven is still possible." His forgiveness, so complete and unshaken, became a sermon in itself. People began to speak of him not only as a healer of bodies, but as a physician of the heart. Even those who once mocked his humility began to seek his prayers. "Brother Martin," they would say, "pray that I may learn patience." He would smile and answer, "Patience is not learned. It is given when we choose not to judge." In those quiet exchanges, he changed more hearts than 1,000 sermons could have. And yet, beneath his serenity, there were moments of deep weariness. Alone in his cell at night, he would sometimes rest his head on his folded arms and whisper, "Lord, I am tired of being misunderstood, but if this is my cross, let me carry it with love." In that prayer, all his struggles, all his silent wounds, were gathered into grace. He bore his suffering not as a burden, but as a seed, one that would bear fruit in souls long after he was gone. When others saw scarcity, Martin saw abundance. It was the paradox that defined his entire life, the capacity to see where others were blind, to hope where others despaired, and to believe that love could multiply anything it touched. The years passed quietly, but within that still rhythm, the strange fragrance of miracle began to settle like incense over everything he did. Those who once called him a servant now sought him as a saint. But Martin did not change. He still swept the floors, tended the sick, and mended torn habits. He still called himself the mulatto of the broom. And yet, even in that humility, God continued to reveal through him a love that could not be hidden. It was during one hard winter that the brothers first witnessed the miracle of multiplication. The convent had fallen into poverty again. Food was scarce, debts were heavy, and the prior was anxious. One morning, Martin entered the kitchen to find only a single loaf of bread remaining. The cook, nearly in tears, said, "Brother Martin, how can we feed 40 men with this?" Martin took the loaf into his hands, made the sign of the cross, and said softly, "God fed thousands with less." He began to slice the bread, piece after piece, until every friar had a portion. When the basket was passed again, it was still full. The brothers stared in silence as Martin distributed bread a second time, then a third. No matter how many took from it, the basket never emptied. "You see," Martin said gently, "the Lord's hand is not short." Such moments multiplied as quietly as the bread itself. A starving family once came to the convent gate. Martin went to the pantry and found it empty. He closed the door, knelt on the floor and prayed, "Lord, you fed your children in the desert. Feed them now." When he rose, the shelves were filled, sacks of grain, jars of oil, baskets of fruit. He carried the food himself to the family's home. They wept and tried to thank him, but he only said, "Give thanks to him who never forgets his poor." The friars who heard the story marveled, but Martin forbade them to speak of it. "If I am praised," he said, "then I take what belongs to God." Yet there was something in the way he carried himself that betrayed a quiet joy, not pride, but the radiance of a soul at peace with heaven. He seemed to live in constant awareness of God's nearness. When asked how he prayed, he answered simply, "By loving." He saw no difference between work and prayer, between feeding a beggar and adoring the Eucharist. "Christ is hungry twice," he would say, once in the poor and once in the host. Feed him both times. This truth guided every act of his life. The city beyond the convent walls began to notice that when Martin walked through the streets, peace seemed to follow him. The beggars called him the father of the poor, the slaves called him brother, and even the nobles began to bow their heads in his presence. Yet he never allowed reverence to rest upon him. When people tried to kiss his hand, he withdrew it quickly. "I am not the source," he would say. "I am only the cup that carries the water." But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Martin's miracles was their simplicity. They were never loud or theatrical, never performed to prove or impress. Once, during a famine, he visited the prison where dozens of men were starving. He brought with him a single pot of stew and a basket of bread. The guards laughed and said, "You will feed only a few." Martin smiled. "God will feed them all." He prayed and ladled the stew until every prisoner had eaten their fill. When he returned to the convent, the pot was still full. "The Lord provides for those who cannot repay," he said softly. There was another time when he visited a poor widow who had nothing left but a small candle. Her children were cold and hungry, and she wept as she told him of her despair. Martin placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "Have faith. Light this candle and trust that its flame will not die until your hope returns." She did as he said. Days passed, and the candle burned but was never consumed. When at last her husband returned from sea with food and wages, she found the candle still glowing. She brought it to Martin in gratitude, but he told her to keep it. "Let it remind you," he said, "that God doesn't forget his children in the dark." Even within the convent, his generosity seemed limitless. When a poor man came begging at the gate, Martin gave him his own cloak. When another needed shoes, Martin gave him his sandals. When one of the novices fell ill, Martin sat by his bed through the night, refusing to leave until the fever broke. "Brother Martin," the prior said once, "you give away everything you have. What will you keep for yourself?" Martin smiled. "Only my trust in God, Father. That cannot be stolen." And yet he did not give from wealth, but from poverty. Often, after sharing all he had, he would go without food himself. He never complained. When others noticed his thinness and begged him to eat, he would reply, "The poor are my table. When they are fed, I am satisfied." The brothers began to understand that his poverty was not deprivation, but freedom. Freedom from fear, from want, from the illusion of ownership. "Heaven," he once said, "is not far away. It begins when we no longer cling to what we cannot keep." There were moments, however, when his charity seemed to defy not just reason, but nature itself. Once, a ship docked in Lima, carrying sailors stricken by fever. No one dared approach them for fear of contagion. Martin boarded the ship alone, carrying water and bread. He prayed over each man, washing their faces, cooling their brows. By morning, all were healed. When the captain tried to reward him, Martin refused, saying, "I have already been paid," in their smiles. The prior, now grown old, once asked him, "Brother Martin, what do you think heaven is like?" Martin thought for a moment and said, "It is a place where everyone gives until no one lacks." The prior nodded and whispered, "Then, brother, you have already begun to live there." It was around this time that stories of his miracles began to spread far beyond Lima. Travelers carried them across the seas to Spain, to Africa, to the islands. Some scoffed, others believed. But those who had known him, who had seen his hands lift the dying, his smile calm the angry, his prayers feed the hungry, needed no convincing. They said simply, We have seen love do what gold cannot. For all his wonders, Martin remained hidden in humility. When praised, he bowed his head. When people tried to thank him, he deflected it to God. If a candle gives light, he said, it is because it burns. He understood that every act of mercy required a cost, and he was willing to pay it in full. He slept little, ate little, and worked without rest. "Why do you tire yourself so?" a friar asked him once. Martin replied, "Because love is not rest, it is life." Even nature seemed to conspire to affirm his faith. The garden he tended flourished year-round, its flowers blooming even in the dry season. Birds nested near his window, and the convent cats curled at his feet. "They know peace," he said. "When we have peace in our hearts, creation will rest beside us." And yet, though miracles surrounded him, Martin never saw them as his own. "God multiplies love," he said. "When we give it away, it grows." Those words became his legacy, the simple creed by which he lived, the silent gospel he preached through every gesture. There were whispers that he had been seen across the sea. At first the brothers laughed when they heard such stories, for how could a man who had never left Lima appear in places far beyond its shores? But as the tales multiplied, they began to listen more carefully. Sailors swore that during storms on the Pacific, a humble friar in a dark habit had appeared on the deck, calming the waves with a word and vanishing when the skies cleared. Missionaries returning from Mexico claimed that a man named Martin had helped them during an epidemic, tending to the sick in the very hour when he was known to be working in the convent infirmary in Peru. When they described his appearance, his gentle eyes, his quiet voice, the mark of humility that seemed to radiate from him, the brothers grew silent, for they knew that description too well. Martin never confirmed these stories. When asked directly, he would smile faintly and say, "Love travels faster than I do." And yet it seemed that heaven was no longer bound by distance when he prayed. It was as if his compassion, so vast, had stretched itself beyond the walls of his world and reached across oceans to those who needed him. He did not speak of it as miracle, but as mercy, and for him, mercy had no geography. "When the heart is full," he once said, "it spills over. It cannot stay in one place." The brothers who lived with him witnessed other mysteries, the kind that make the soul tremble not with fear, but with awe. Once, when a friar in Mexico lay dying, Martin was seen entering his cell in Lima at that very moment, pale and exhausted. "Brother," he whispered to the prior, "I must rest. The sea is long." The next ship from Mexico brought word of the friar's peaceful death, and of a dark-skinned healer who had appeared by his bedside, prayed over him, and disappeared. The prior wept when he heard it and said, "The Lord sends his servants where he wills." In those years, Martin's life became a tapestry of silent wonders. He moved through the convent as before, sweeping, cleaning, healing, and praying. But those who watched him closely began to notice a strange light in his eyes, as though he saw something invisible to others. He walked slowly, often pausing mid-task as if listening to an unseen voice. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of his sweeping, lean the broom against the wall, and whisper a prayer. When asked what he was doing, he said, "Someone far away is in need." And then, as if nothing had happened, he would resume his work. To Martin, the separation between heaven and earth was a thin veil, and he lived with one foot on either side. When people marveled at his gifts, he would say, "There is no distance in love. The Lord can carry a soul wherever compassion calls it." He believed that prayer was not confined to words or rooms or even time. "When we pray," he told the novices, "we join the choir of heaven, and their song knows no boundaries." His humility, however, remained constant. The more extraordinary the stories grew, the quieter he became. When others tried to question him about bilocation, he turned the conversation to other things: the needs of the poor, the mercy of God, the beauty of creation. "If the Lord allows such things," he said, "it is not to exalt the man, but to comfort the afflicted. The less I speak of them, the more he is known." The prior once pressed him gently, asking if he truly believed he had been in more than one place at once. Martin smiled and said, "Father, when you send a letter, do you not remain in your cell while your words travel the world? God can do the same with a soul." Beyond Lima, word of his compassion began to travel faster than rumor. Ships leaving Callao carried tales of the Dominican brother who healed the sick with a touch, who tamed wild animals, who appeared in places impossible for any man to reach. In Cartagena, sailors swore he had appeared in a hospital filled with plague victims, bringing food and comfort. In Panama, a woman claimed he had rescued her child from drowning, though he was seen in Lima the same night. The stories were strange, yet their pattern was the same. Always the suffering, always the poor, always mercy. It was as if Martin's heart, so attuned to pain, could not be contained by one body. Among the friars, these accounts inspired both wonder and reflection. Some found faith renewed, others were troubled. "Could it be true?" one novice asked. "Can a man be in two places?" An older friar answered, "Perhaps not by flesh, but by love." That phrase spread through the convent and beyond. For Martin's life had become a living parable of love that refused limitation, love so pure that even the walls of time and space could not hold it. Even as he became the subject of reverence and awe, Martin remained the servant of the servants. He still washed dishes, mended clothes, and cleaned the chapel. He still called himself the mulatto of the broom. When someone once asked him how he could perform miracles and yet remain so lowly, he replied, "Because I know myself. Without him, I am nothing but dust. If God can use dust to heal, it is his glory, not mine." There was one evening when the brothers gathered in the courtyard after Compline, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine. A missionary newly arrived from the Philippines began to tell of a story he had heard during his voyage. "They speak there," he said, "of a brown friar who appeared among them one night, feeding the starving and speaking words of peace. They say he wore the habit of Saint Dominic and vanished before dawn." The brothers turned to look at Martin, who stood at the edge of the courtyard, holding his broom. He smiled, bowed slightly, and said, "Then God must have great mercy to send help so far." He returned to his work as the others watched in silence. Not all were comfortable with such mysteries. Some within the church hesitated to speak of them publicly, fearing skepticism or scandal. But those who had known Martin personally saw no reason for doubt. "He belongs to both worlds," one brother said. "He prays here, but his prayers are answered elsewhere." Through it all, Martin's compassion for the people of Lima deepened. He spent every spare moment in the streets, bringing food to the hungry, tending to the sick, and comforting the dying. The poor called him Padre Santo, though he was not a priest. The rich, humbled by his holiness, came to him for counsel. Once, when a nobleman asked how to live a holy life, Martin replied, "Give what you cannot keep, forgive what you cannot forget, love where it is hardest." The nobleman went away in tears, for he understood that holiness, as Martin lived it, was not privilege but surrender. Sometimes, in his prayer, Martin would whisper names no one else knew. "Who are you praying for?" a friar once asked. Martin looked up and said softly, "For those I have never met." When the friar frowned in confusion, Martin added, The world is full of souls waiting for prayer. Why should we pray only for those we see? His sense of connection to the whole human family was as boundless as his miracles. In every stranger, he saw a brother. In every creature, a reflection of divine goodness. He was, as one witness later said, a man who lived as though the entire earth were his parish. Sometimes, when the chapel grew still, his body no longer obeyed the earth. It began quietly, unnoticed at first, like everything holy in Martin's life. The friars had long known that he prayed with uncommon devotion, often remaining before the Blessed Sacrament for hours without stirring, his eyes fixed on the tabernacle, as if drawn into its mystery. But one evening, a young novice entered the chapel late and saw what words could hardly describe. There was Martin, kneeling in prayer, his hands clasped and his face lifted upward, yet he was no longer touching the floor. He hovered several inches above the stone, weightless and radiant, his expression peaceful and filled with awe. The novice froze, unable to breathe, certain that he had stumbled upon a vision. Then Martin opened his eyes, saw the boy's terror, and smiled with a calm that only deepened the mystery. "Do not fear, brother," he whispered. "The Lord sometimes lifts his servants when love grows too heavy for the earth." Such moments occurred more often as the years passed. The brothers began to speak of them in hushed tones, not with disbelief, but with reverence. They would find him in the chapel at night, suspended above the ground, surrounded by a light so soft it seemed to come from within him. At times, the fragrance of flowers filled the air, lilies, roses, and herbs from no garden they knew. When they approached, the light faded, and Martin would descend gently, returning to his place of prayer as though nothing had happened. If questioned, he would lower his eyes and say only, "It is nothing. When the soul forgets itself, the body follows." Those who knew him best understood that his levitations were not displays of power, but the natural overflow of love. His heart had become so attuned to heaven that the laws of earth seemed to loosen their hold on him. He did not seek these moments. Indeed, he often prayed that they would cease, fearing attention. "Lord," he said, "let me stay low, for you alone should be lifted up." But heaven, it seemed, would not deny itself the joy of drawing him nearer. When he prayed, he forgot himself so completely that his spirit soared beyond the visible world. Those who saw him described it as watching a flame drawn upward by an unseen wind. There were other signs, too, moments when light seemed to gather around him in quiet radiance. Once, during the celebration of Mass, the friars saw him kneeling near the altar, his face illumined with an otherworldly glow. The priest later said he felt as though an invisible hand had steadied him through the consecration, as if heaven itself was near. Another time, while praying for a dying child, those present swore that the room brightened, and the child's breathing eased until peace returned. Martin always deflected such stories. "It is faith," he would insist, "not light that heals." He often spoke of God's presence as something tangible, closer than breath. "He is not far," he told a young friar. "We think of heaven as above, but it is all around. When we love purely, we live already in its light." For him, the Eucharist was the very heart of that light. Each day, after receiving communion, he would remain kneeling long after others had risen. His eyes would close, and his lips would move silently. Those who watched said it was as if he entered another realm, unseen by all but God. Once, when a brother asked what he experienced in those moments, he answered gently, "I see only love, boundless, burning, merciful. It is too beautiful for words." There were nights when the brothers would find him in the garden, his hands raised to the stars, his body lifted from the earth as though the heavens themselves had drawn him upward. One brother, trembling, whispered to another, "He prays as the angels must pray." But Martin, when they spoke to him later, would only shake his head. "If I rise," he said, "it is only because my soul forgets its weight in the presence of God. The closer one draws to the light, the less one remembers the dust." His levitations, though wondrous, were not what defined his sanctity. They were signs, not substance. The true miracle lay in his humility, that a man who could soar above the ground would still bow low to sweep its floors. After one such occurrence, the prior called him gently to his chamber and said, "Brother Martin, if you are seen floating again, some may not understand. You could be accused of pride or illusion." Martin bowed deeply. "Forgive me, Father. If I could bind myself to the earth, I would. I have no desire to be seen." The prior, moved by his sincerity, replied, "Then it is surely God, not vanity, that lifts you." Stories of these events reached beyond the convent walls, carried by those who had witnessed them in silence for years. The people of Lima began to speak of Martin not only as a healer, but as a living vessel of divine mystery. Yet, he never allowed such talk to distract him from his service. Each morning found him back at his broom, back at the infirmary, back at the side of the poor. "Holiness," he once told a friend, "is not in the rising, but in returning." Indeed, he seemed to carry heaven into every mundane act. When he walked through the garden, the flowers seemed to lift their heads toward him. When he entered a sick room, the air grew calm, and even those near death felt peace descend upon them. His very presence was a balm. Some said that light clung to him even when he worked, glimmering faintly around his hands as he dressed wounds or blessed the dying. When asked if he was aware of it, he laughed softly. "If light follows, it is because love is bright," he said. "I see no glow but that which shines in others." His relationship with nature deepened too. Birds often gathered near him as he prayed outdoors. One brother swore that he saw a dove perch upon Martin's shoulder during prayer and remain there until dawn. Martin said nothing of it. "Perhaps it was cold," he joked, though his eyes betrayed something more profound, an awareness that all creation shared in the mystery of divine affection. It was during this time that Martin's health began to decline. Years of fasting and labor had weakened his body, though his spirit showed no sign of fatigue. When urged to rest, he would reply, "Rest is for heaven. Here there is work." Still, the long hours of prayer took their toll. He often fainted in the chapel or the infirmary, only to rise moments later, apologizing for causing concern. The brothers worried, but he assured them, "The soul doesn't grow weary when it loves." One evening, as the community prayed Compline, a storm rolled over Lima. The thunder shook the walls, and lightning flashed across the sky. The brothers hurried to close the shutters, but Martin remained kneeling in the chapel, his face serene. As the storm raged, a sudden calm filled the air around him. A flash of light illuminated his figure, not the white glare of lightning, but a golden radiance, soft and steady. The brothers who saw it later swore that the storm ceased at that very moment. When they approached him, he whispered, "Even storms have ears. When they hear praise, they quiet." In these final years of visible wonder, Martin's soul seemed to dwell halfway between earth and eternity. He was no longer merely a servant or healer. He had become a vessel of divine peace. The brothers, once skeptical, began to treat him with quiet reverence. They saw in him what every human heart longs for, the evidence that love, when pure, lifts the soul beyond every boundary, even that of gravity itself. While others fled disease, Martin ran toward it. The city of Lima was no stranger to sickness, but when the plague descended once more upon its crowded streets, fear spread faster than fever. Doors were barred, processions halted, and the air itself seemed to thicken with dread. Within the Dominican convent, the brothers trembled, praying that their walls might keep death away. But Martin, who had long called suffering his companion, saw in this terror only a greater call to love. "It is not the healthy who need comfort," he said quietly. "If we would touch Christ, we must go where he suffers." And so, with his broom still in hand, he began to visit the afflicted. He walked through the narrow alleys where the sick lay abandoned, where the stench of death mingled with prayer. Those who saw him pass said that his presence carried the scent of clean air after rain. He entered homes others would not, knelt beside the dying, and whispered words of peace. When no doctor dared approach, Martin came with herbs and water, washing the sores of the fevered with his bare hands. He spoke softly to them, calling each by name when he could, and when names were forgotten, he called them brother, sister, or simply child. Some said that wherever he went, the moaning of pain lessened, and for a moment despair gave way to stillness. Within the convent infirmary, Martin's work was relentless. Beds filled faster than they could be emptied, and even the strongest friars fell ill. He tended to them all with equal tenderness. One night, when several brothers lay dying in a locked ward, a measure taken to prevent contagion, Martin approached the door and asked the porter to open it. The man refused, saying the prior's orders were clear. Martin bowed and walked away, but when the porter returned hours later, he found Martin inside, kneeling beside the dying. "How did you enter?" the porter asked, his voice trembling. Martin only smiled and said, "Where charity calls, the door is always open." The next morning, every man in that room began to recover. His service knew no limit. When there was not enough food to feed the sick, he shared his own portion, fasting until his hands shook with weakness. When there was no medicine left, he prayed, and the fevers broke nonetheless. It was said that sometimes the dying would cling to him, unwilling to let go. "Do not fear," he would whisper. "You are going home. He waits for you." Many died with a faint smile, as if seeing what he saw. The brothers watched in awe as Martin's compassion transformed the infirmary from a place of dread into a house of grace. Even the animals seemed to play their part. Dogs brought scraps of food to the door, and birds gathered at the windowsills, singing as if to console the sick. "All creation joins in mercy," Martin said. "It is man who forgets his part in the song." His miracles during this time were countless, though he spoke of none. Once, a friar struck by fever was left unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. The others feared he would not last the night. Martin knelt beside him, placed a cool hand upon his chest, and prayed silently for hours. When dawn came, the fever was gone, and the friar was sitting upright, asking for water. Another time, an epidemic spread among the slaves who worked the city's docks. Martin went to them day after day, dressing wounds, feeding the weak, and burying the dead when no one else dared. One overseer, hardened by years of cruelty, mocked him for wasting time on those worthless creatures. Martin looked at him and said gently, "They are worth the price of his blood." The man had no answer, but from that day forward, he began to help Martin in secret. His compassion reached beyond the sick to those who feared sickness. Many times, the wealthy sent for him in panic, hoping his prayers would shield their homes. He went not as a talisman, but as a teacher. "Charity," he said, "is the strongest protection. When we care for others, God cares for us." In one such home, where a nobleman's wife lay dying, Martin entered quietly, knelt beside her bed, and traced the sign of the cross in the air. Those in the room swore they saw light pass from his hands to her face. She recovered within hours, and later gave her fortune to the poor. For all his labor, Martin never sought rest. The brothers would sometimes find him asleep on the floor of the infirmary, his head resting against a wall, his rosary still tangled in his fingers. When scolded, he would laugh softly and say, "I sleep little, but I dream of heaven. That is enough." They noticed that his strength seemed to come from prayer, as though every time he gave himself away, God filled him again. "The body tires," he once said, "but love renews itself." There was one night when the infirmary was fuller than ever, and Martin moved among the beds like a shadow of mercy. A young novice, watching him, whispered, "Does he never tire of suffering?" Martin overheard and smiled. "Suffering," he said, "is the language of love. It teaches us to listen." The novice did not understand then, but years later, he would recall those words as the truest he had ever heard. His care extended beyond the walls of the convent. He founded a small shelter in the city where the abandoned and dying could find peace in their last hours. He called it simply, "The House of Mercy." There he spent his evenings after his duties, washing feet, preparing food, and praying with those who had no one else. When questioned by the prior about leaving the convent at such late hours, he answered, "Father, I cannot sleep while Christ waits in the street." The prior could not argue. The people of Lima came to see Martin not merely as a healer, but as a living embodiment of compassion. Slaves brought their sick children to him. Merchants sought his blessing before voyages. Beggars followed him through the streets. Yet he remained untouched by pride. "I am only a poor instrument," he would say. "If music comes, it is from the Master's breath." He refused payment for his miracles, taking instead small gifts which he gave immediately to those in need. Once, when a wealthy lady pressed a purse of coins into his hand, he gave it to a blind man at the gate without even opening it. "He will see more use for it than I," he said with a smile. But not every healing was of the body. Many came to him broken in spirit, men tormented by guilt, women crushed by sorrow, priests burdened by doubt. To each he offered the same medicine, a listening heart. "Speak," he would say. "God listens through me." Often he said little in return, but his silence itself was healing, for it carried no judgment, only peace. As the plague subsided and the city began to breathe again, the brothers looked back on those terrible months with wonder. Not one of them had perished. Not one had been left unattended. They spoke among themselves of what they had seen. Fevers vanishing, wounds closing, despair turned to joy, and each knew it was Martin's love that had shielded them. When the prior thanked him publicly, Martin lowered his head and said, "Father, it was the prayers of the sick that saved us. God hears them first." He continued to serve long after the danger passed, visiting prisons, hospitals, and the poorest quarters of Lima. His compassion had no limit, his patience no exhaustion. Even as his body weakened, his spirit only grew stronger. "The heart," he said, "is like a candle. The more it burns, the brighter the room." And in that brightness he lived, a man whose every breath was prayer, whose every act was a hymn of mercy. As the body weakened, the spirit became flame. In the final years of his life, Martin's strength began to fade, though few could tell at first. He continued to rise before dawn, to sweep the same corridors, to tend the sick and the poor with the same serenity that had always marked him. Yet those who knew him closely saw that his steps grew slower, that his once steady hands trembled as he worked. The long hours of fasting, the endless nights of prayer, and the constant labor of love had worn his body thin. His skin, always dark and luminous, took on a pallor that seemed to belong more to heaven than earth. He laughed often still, but his laughter carried a softness now, the sound of one who already heard music from another world. He never spoke of his pain. When questioned, he would answer, "A servant should not complain while his master suffers." But in the quiet of his cell, he began to experience what he called the night of the soul, that strange and holy darkness where God seems silent, where the spirit must love without comfort. The brothers sometimes found him in prayer, tears streaming down his face, whispering words they could not hear. Once, when the prior asked what troubled him, Martin replied, "It is not sorrow, Father. It is love that has become too vast for my heart." Despite his failing health, he continued to work in the infirmary. He would drag himself from bed at the sound of a groan or the cry of a sick man, leaning on his broom as a staff. "Brother Martin," the younger friars pleaded, "let us serve you for once." He shook his head gently. "I will rest when love no longer suffers in the world." They could not dissuade him. To the end, his heart belonged to those in pain. It seemed as though his body, though frail, was carried forward by the same grace that had lifted him in prayer. It was during this time that his visions became more frequent. He would often speak softly to invisible guests, smiling as though in conversation. Once, a novice entered his cell at night and found him gazing towards the corner, where a light flickered, though no candle burned. "Who is with you, brother?" the novice whispered, frightened. Martin turned and said, "Only friends. Saints, angels, the poor souls who visit from purgatory to ask for prayer. They are never far." The novice fled, but Martin smiled and returned to his silent communion. He seemed already to live between two worlds, his feet in the dust, his spirit in the light. The brothers began to notice other signs as well. The fragrance of lilies often filled the convent when Martin prayed, though none were in bloom. His room glowed faintly at night, and sometimes voices were heard singing, soft, distant, and unearthly. When asked about these things, he would reply, "Heaven is generous with its comfort, even for the least of us." His humility was untouched by these wonders. "If God sends sweetness," he once said, "it is because the medicine of suffering is bitter. He gives both in measure." Yet his body continued to fail. He developed fevers that would not leave, coughing fits that drained his breath, and pain in his limbs that made even standing an act of will. Still he labored. The poor continued to come to him, and he refused none. He blessed them with hands that trembled and eyes that seemed to look beyond them, as though he saw their souls more clearly than their faces. "Do not grieve," he told one woman who wept at the sight of his weakness. "This flesh is a borrowed garment. Soon I will be clothed in light." He began to speak more often of death, but not as an ending. "Death is only the hand that opens the door," he said. "Beyond it is the home we have been longing for." The brothers, hearing these words, would fall silent. Some wept, for they could not imagine the convent without him. One day, a young friar asked, "Brother Martin, are you not afraid to die?" He smiled and answered, "Why should I fear to go where love comes from?" As the sickness grew worse, he withdrew more frequently into solitude. He ate little, slept less, and spent long hours kneeling before the crucifix in his cell. There, he entered into what seemed to others a mysterious rapture, a union of suffering and peace. Those who entered quietly would see him gazing at the cross with such tenderness that it seemed the wood itself responded. "He prays as one who speaks to a friend," a brother said. "It is as though Christ himself bends to listen." One night, when his pain was at its height, Martin whispered a prayer that those nearby would remember for the rest of their lives. "Lord," he said, "if it is your will that I suffer, I thank you. Let each pain I feel be an offering for those who cannot endure. Let me drink what remains of your cup, that I may love as you have loved." As he finished speaking, peace fell upon him so complete that the brothers wept. From that night forward, he never complained again. He continued to serve as long as he could stand. Even when confined to bed, he asked that the sick be brought to him. "There is still work to do," he said. "I can pray, and that is the greatest labor of all." His prayers became his hands, reaching beyond the walls of his room to comfort those in need. Many testified that they felt his presence beside them in their suffering, even when he could not leave his bed. In those final months, the brothers noticed a transformation in him, a kind of luminous stillness. He seemed always to be listening, as though he heard a music none of them could perceive. When asked what it was, he replied softly, "The song of mercy. It never ceases. It is the sound of God loving his world." The prior, seeing that Martin's end was near, ordered him to rest. "You have done enough," he said. "Now let us serve you." But Martin shook his head. "No, Father, I have done nothing. The Lord lent me his love for a time, and now he will take it back. I am only returning what was never mine." As his final illness deepened, the brothers gathered often around his bed. They read to him from the scriptures, and he listened with eyes closed, his face serene. Sometimes he would murmur the words before they were spoken, as if he knew them by heart from another place. "I have run the race," he whispered once. "Now I wait for the crown that is not made of gold, but of peace." The nights grew longer, and the fever burned steadily. In those hours, the convent grew silent, as though the walls themselves held their breath. The brothers kept vigil, praying softly. Martin drifted in and out of sleep, his lips moving even in dreams. Once, he opened his eyes and said, "There is light everywhere. It is gentle, not blinding. It is calling." The prior knelt beside him and asked, "What do you see, brother?" Martin smiled faintly. "Home," he said. "Only home." When his final hour came, he asked only for forgiveness and love. The news of Martin's failing health had spread quickly through Lima, and before long the gates of the Dominican convent were crowded with people. They came from every corner of the city, nobles and beggars, slaves and merchants, mothers holding children he had once healed, sailors who swore they owed their lives to his prayers. All waited quietly in the streets, their faces lit by the lanterns they carried, whispering rosaries as though each prayer might hold him in this world a little longer. Inside, the convent was still. The friars moved softly through the corridors, their hearts heavy yet full of strange peace. They knew that the man who had lived among them like a servant was about to die as a saint. Martin lay on a narrow bed in the infirmary he had built with his own hands. The same room that had so often been filled with the moans of the sick now glowed with gentle calm. The scent of herbs and oil mingled with the faint perfume of lilies that seemed to rise from nowhere. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale, but his eyes were clear, shining with the same quiet light they had always held. Around him stood the prior and several brothers, along with a few of the poor he had loved so dearly. They wept softly, though he had forbidden sorrow. "Why do you cry?" he whispered, "when I am going home to joy?" The prior knelt beside him, holding his frail hand. "Brother Martin," he said, his voice breaking, "you have taught us more than all the books in this house. You have shown us the face of Christ." Martin smiled faintly. "If you saw Christ in me," he said, "it was only because he chose to hide himself in my weakness." He paused for breath, then added, "Love one another, my brothers, always. It is the only sermon worth preaching." His words were barely more than a breath, but every man in the room heard them as though spoken directly to his soul. Outside, the city bells began to toll the evening hour. The sound rolled across the rooftops, mingling with the murmured prayers of the crowd. A young novice entered the room with tears streaming down his face and said, "Father, the people are praying for you." Martin looked toward the window and whispered, "Pray with them, not for me. Pray that love may live when I am gone." Then, closing his eyes, he murmured a final prayer for those who had wronged him. "Lord, forgive them," he said, "for they did not see you in me. Show them mercy, as you have shown me mercy." It was October 31st, 1639, when the humble friar's life drew to its close. The brothers gathered close, chanting the Salve Regina in low, trembling voices. As the final words rose into the air, Martin's breathing slowed. His lips moved once more in silent prayer. Some said he was whispering the name of Jesus. Others thought he was thanking the Virgin whom he had loved all his life. Then his chest lifted one last time, and he was still. At that moment, those present swore the air filled with a fragrance so pure and sweet that all felt their sorrow vanish. The prior wept openly, saying, "Our brother has gone to heaven by the road he built, the road of humility." News of his death spread through Lima like wind through the city's narrow streets. The crowd outside fell to their knees, and cries of a saint," rose from every direction. Bells rang throughout the night as the people lit candles in their windows. They did not mourn him as one lost, but rejoiced as for one who had returned home. The poor, the sick, the forgotten, they were the first to come, pressing close to the convent gates, each carrying a memory of his kindness. Some brought pieces of his clothing, scraps of cloth he had once touched, or herbs from the gardens he had tended. Others simply knelt and wept, whispering his name. The brothers prepared his body with care and reverence. His face, they said, seemed untouched by death, peaceful as if asleep. The same soft light that had surrounded him in life seemed to linger over his form. His broom, the symbol of his humility, was placed at his side. For 3 days, the people of Lima filed through the chapel to pay their respects. Some swore that the wounds and illnesses they bore vanished as they touched his habit. A crippled man left his crutches behind. A blind woman said she could see the light on his face. The brothers recorded these events quietly, not wishing to draw attention, but the word spread nonetheless. The viceroy himself came to kneel at his bier, weeping like a child. "I have ruled this city," he said, "but he ruled its heart." Even the archbishop, who had once doubted the tales of his miracles, declared, "He was Christ's mercy made flesh." The people took bits of the straw from his mattress, the cords from his robe, anything they could carry, believing that holiness lingered in the touch of the one who had loved without measure. On the day of his burial, the streets overflowed. It was said that the entire city seemed to move as one, a river of grief and gratitude. The procession wound slowly through Lima. Barefoot friars, nobles in mourning, slaves set free for the day in his honor. The air was filled with the tolling of bells and the faint scent of flowers that seemed to bloom out of season. When they lowered his body into the earth, a hush fell over the crowd, followed by the singing of the Te Deum, not in sorrow, but in thanksgiving, for they knew that something eternal had passed among them. In the years that followed, miracles continued at his tomb. The sick were healed, prisoners found comfort, and hearts divided by hatred were reconciled. The people began to call him Father of Charity, Saint of the Poor, the Angel of Peru. Pilgrims came from distant lands to kneel at his grave. Even those who had never known him felt as though they had lost a friend. And indeed, his spirit seemed to linger, in the hospitals he had served, in the convent garden where the animals still gathered, in the hearts of those who remembered his smile. Decades passed, and his story spread across oceans. Artists painted him surrounded by animals, a broom in one hand and a cross in the other. Poets wrote of his gentleness, and preachers spoke of his humility. In 1837, 200 years after his death, Pope Gregory XVI declared him blessed, and in 1962, Pope John XXIII canonized him as Saint Martin de Porres, the first black saint of the Americas, patron of social justice, of barbers and healers, and of all who serve quietly in love. Yet long before the Church gave him a title, the people of Lima had already known. They had known it in his touch, in his silence, in the way the air seemed to brighten wherever he passed. They had known it in the peace that filled their hearts when they whispered his name. Saint was only the word the world used for what heaven had long proclaimed. And so the man who had been born an outcast died a light to nations. He had no wealth, no learning, no power, only love, pure and boundless. In him, the poor found a friend, the proud found humility, and the broken found hope. When the friars spoke of him in later years, they said that his memory was like the fragrance of incense, invisible yet enduring, sweetening the air long after the fire was gone. Centuries have passed, yet his presence lingers in every act of humble kindness. The story of Saint Martin de Porres has become more than history. It is a living echo that continues to awaken hearts wherever compassion struggles to breathe. In the soft light of dawn that breaks over Lima, his name is still whispered in prayer, his image still found in small chapels and crowded homes, where the poor keep him close as one of their own. Though time has carried away the sound of his voice and the rhythm of his steps through the convent halls, the fragrance of his charity remains. His broom has long since turned to dust, yet its sweep is felt in every soul that finds holiness in service. The centuries have done nothing to dim the wonder of his story. Artists, priests, and pilgrims alike have returned to his life seeking not spectacle, but guidance. What was it in him that could command mice to obey, heal the sick with a touch, cross oceans without leaving his cell, and yet still call himself unworthy? The answer, as every saint teaches, was not power, but surrender. Martin's holiness lay in his refusal to claim ownership of grace. He knew that to love without measure is to step aside and allow God to act. "When a man is empty," he once said, "God can fill him completely." That emptiness became his greatness, and the world has never ceased to be filled by it. In the streets of modern Lima, the convent of Our Lady of the Rosary still stands, its white walls quiet beneath the hum of traffic. Pilgrims file through its gates each day to visit the room where Martin lived, the infirmary where he served, the small garden where birds once rested at his feet. There, beside a simple stone bearing his name, the faithful kneel to ask for healing, for patience, for the strength to forgive. Many leave flowers or candles. Some leave small brooms, tokens of his humility. The brothers who care for the convent say that the scent of lilies still appears on certain days, strong and sweet, with no source to be found. They smile and say, "He is still working." His influence has traveled far beyond Peru. Across the Americas and beyond the seas, churches, hospitals, and schools bear his name. In places where division once reigned, his image now stands as a symbol of reconciliation. He has become a patron for those the world forgets. The laborer, the servant, the outcast, the child who wonders if his life can matter. In every nation touched by injustice, his story is told as a quiet reminder that sanctity is not reserved for the powerful, but offered to the meek. "There are no walls in heaven," one devotee once said, and Saint Martin was already living there. The Church has placed his feast on the 3rd of November, when autumn light softens and the air carries the scent of turning earth. In that season, faithful people gather to celebrate not the miracles of his hands, but the tenderness of his heart. They read aloud the gospel that defined him, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me." They tell again how a poor man, born in rejection, became a bridge between heaven and earth. And in their retelling, Martin lives again, not as a distant figure in a gilded frame, but as a brother standing beside them in the dust of their own days. His example continues to challenge as much as it comforts. In a world where pride and noise still drown the whisper of grace, his life stands as quiet contradiction. He teaches that holiness is not escape, but encounter, not separation from the world, but deeper immersion in its pain. His sanctity was not in fleeing suffering, but in transforming it into compassion. When people pray to him now, they do not ask for wonders of power, but for the miracle of gentleness, the ability to serve without recognition, to forgive without measure, to love without reward. It is a harder miracle, but the one the world needs most. Among those who have drawn strength from his example are the poor and forgotten of every age. In prisons and hospitals, in villages and cities, his name is spoken like a friend's. A mother in the Andes prays to him for her sick child. A young man in New York whispers his name before opening his barber shop. A nurse in Manila keeps his picture tucked in her pocket. He belongs to all of them because he belonged to none but God. Wherever there is kindness, his spirit seems to pass by, invisible, unannounced, like the soft sweep of a broom across a silent floor. The world he knew has changed, yet its wounds remain familiar. Racism, poverty, and pride still divide hearts as they did in his time. And so his witness endures not as memory, but as remedy. When people speak of justice today, they often remember him, the brown-skinned friar who saw dignity in every face, who knelt beside the slave and the noble with equal reverence. In his humility, he proclaimed what generations later would name equality, that all are one in Christ. His voice, though silent in death, continues to remind the Church and the world that compassion is the truest form of strength. His image, painted in countless ways, always shows the same symbols: the broom, the cross, the animals at his feet. Yet behind those symbols lies something deeper, the union of heaven's grandeur with earth's simplicity. For Martin, the sweep of a broom was as sacred as the raising of a chalice. The feeding of a stray animal was as holy as the chanting of a psalm. He erased the line between the sacred and the ordinary until all of life shone with the same light. Those who look upon his image often say they feel calmer, as though his gaze invites them to rest in gentleness. Peace, that gaze seems to say, is possible if only we love. And his miracles have not ceased. Testimonies continue to emerge of healing, of protection, of sudden reconciliation. A child recovers from illness after a prayer to Saint Martin. A father and son estranged for years find forgiveness on his feast day. A nurse tending to the dying senses a warmth beside her bed and finds strength renewed. These are not the grand miracles of legend, but the quiet restorations that mark his enduring presence. They are the same kind of miracles he worked in life, the ones that begin not with power, but with tenderness. Yet even beyond miracles, his story remains a compass pointing toward what is eternal. It teaches that holiness is possible in every station, that divine love is not distant, but waiting in the tasks of each day. To sweep a floor, to comfort the sick, to feed the hungry, these acts, repeated in love, become the prayer of the world. Martin showed that the smallest act done for God outweighs the grandest ambition done for self. He left behind no writings, no monuments, no philosophy, only the living example of love made practical, patient, and joyful. And so, in every heart that bends to serve, his Spirit continues its quiet work. Each time a child is fed, a wound is healed, or forgiveness is given where anger once ruled, the Saint of Lima breathes again through the world. He stands not in marble or gold, but in the gesture of mercy that passes unnoticed. He remains, as he always was, the servant who became light, the one who loved the lowest and found in them the face of God.